Hello. So today we're going to talk about literacy strategies in social studies. And you knew that already. That's why I'm sending you this video. So I'm going to babble on a little bit. It'll probably fit into 2 videos total. And the way I'm going to do it may not seem very professional, but I'm going to occasionally hold up the slide that I'm talking about, and but you've got this sent to you in a Word document, so you can follow along that way. So here we have literacy strategies in social studies. The reason that this is an issue now, obviously, is that historians have not been very good at following literacy strategies. They've done sort of what they've wanted to do rather than following new research in this field, and that has been a missed opportunity for many history teachers. So we want you to go out into the field and practice the best strategies, and those strategies, many of them come from the field of composition and rhetoric. So many of the ideas that we'll talk about today come from my studies in composition and rhetoric with the Reading Institute for Academic Preparation, with the National Writing Project, and with well, I did IWT a little bit also, which you guys have done as well. So this is an issue because, as you can see from our lovely handout, the average SAT reading score in 2011 was the lowest since 1972. Yay. So we want to turn that around, and history, especially with Common Core coming down the pipe, as a great opportunity to do that. According to Carnevale and DeRochers in 2004, Kirsch, Braun, Yamamoto, and Sum in 2007, somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of all the jobs in the near future, in the next 15 to 20 years, will require a college education and higher level literacy skills. And that comes from a state report called Writing to Read, and it's something that we need to be thinking about. There is special cause for concern, as you can also see here in this. Should I ding every time you change the page? Bing. There's special cause for concern if you look at some of these numbers on your handout. As Chris Tovani writes, one critical concept embraced by both researchers and literacy specialists is that learning to read doesn't end in the elementary grades. So we need to get beyond this idea that learning to read is actually about decoding, and get to the point where we understand that learning to read is a process, and it's a lifelong process, and it's something that is complex, and it doesn't end in 4th grade, and it doesn't end in 6th, and it doesn't end in high school either. And you guys can probably tell that. You are continuing to learn to read now. So your job, we need to get into your heads also, is to teach reading as well as to teach all these other fabulous ideas that you have. I showed you that one. So this is especially important because, as the philosopher Kenneth Burke says, reading provides imaginative rehearsals for the world, for the real world. Imaginative rehearsals for the real world. So that's what we want. We want these students to have more and more of these imaginative rehearsals where they're moving into a book, rehearsing there for a while, and then moving out of a book. We think that is incredibly important. Then there are also some thinking strategies, and this is on your page that looks like this, that says thinking strategies used by proficient readers and writers. And there's some fabulous strategies on this one that good readers and writers use all the time to monitor their understanding. We don't even think about doing this. It just becomes totally innate. And that's dangerous as teachers, because we're much better readers than we let on. And we need to show students how we've learned to read, even as we're continuing to learn to read with new texts. So look at those strategies. They are, as it says there, it's adopted from Pearson et al. In 1992. It's a little dated, but not really, because they're just strategies, and they're great ones also. So moving forward, I think it's important that you create in your classrooms a space for collaboration, for literary collaboration especially, because, as John Steinbeck said, John Steinbeck, no one wants advice, only collaboration. So we need to get to the point where you do understand that writing in the history classroom is about collaboration. So you can classify my remarks today then under that collaboration in the history classroom or literacy in the social studies classroom, but with the inside scoop that these form part of a larger project that's tentatively titled on the abolition or on the advancement of historical thinking through the abolition of history teaching. You see, the crux of the problem in this is this in history. History teachers have a dirty little secret that they don't want to share with you. Don't tell anyone. They're not comfortable talking about this. History teachers are fact fetished. They sometimes prefer facts over people. Sometimes they're better with facts than people even. So trying new strategies, learning new literacy strategies will ensure that you don't become fact fetished, and it will ensure that you're not so overwhelmingly burdensome to your students with all of your facts and your names and your lovely dates and things that we can pin ourselves on rather than things that are somewhat unknown and flexible. So we want to offer them experiences with texts, introductions to what we have called together history as a foreign language. History is something that is entirely foreign and that they need to be brought into so that they can better understand. So take these suggestions as ideas for your perusal, simply notions of literacy in the social studies context that might guide your thinking and planning. And then with that introduction, I'm having a problem because my ear is kind of stopped up. So if every now and then I go like this, that's why. Hideous. So let's file these thoughts under 10 thoughts on how to rethink literacy and social studies. And once again, remember, teaching social studies, history, government, economics, whatever it is teaching literacy, and it is teaching reading and writing. So remember that. So we start with a very important rule. So rule number 1 is from our friend Peter Elbow. Rule number 1 is is that there are 2 extremely important revision rules. Historians are terrible at revision in general, or history teachers are. So the 2 most important rules of revision are, number 1, the reader is always right. So if you've got a classroom where you have some revision, some peer revision going on, you have to, by all means, create a space where the reader of a piece of work feels like he or she can have absolutely any sort of interaction with that work and can make any comment, and that those comments will be seen as law, that those will be seen as wonderful and exactly what that piece of work needs. But the second rule of Peter Elbow is equally important, and that's that the writer is always right. So we need to remember, yes, the reader is absolutely correct. Whatever brilliant remark they're making is absolutely correct. But then within that, the author has the final say. So if a reader says this sentence just sounds off, it sounds like it doesn't belong in this piece of writing, get rid of it, that is absolutely correct. But does the writer have to change it? No. So you create a space where the reader has total freedom of expression, and the writer has total freedom of editorial control, if you will. The second big theme that we'll talk about, the second of our 10 rules for writing or literacy strategies in the social studies classroom, is from Sheridan Blau. Social studies classes should be much more confusing. So this is a moment with our friend Sheridan Blau. There he is. Isn't he great? So one of the things that Sheridan is now sort of famous for talking about is this idea of confusion. And we've talked about this before, but it just goes, it's worth mentioning here because it is a sort of underlying idea that is starting to undergird a lot of thinking about pedagogy. As Blau says, confusion represents an advanced state of understanding. We need to understand that students should not be able to listen to our lessons and immediately understand them. If they are, then you've asked the wrong questions, you've taken the wrong approach, you've given them something that they don't have to digest. You've already, like some awful mother bird, pre-digested it for them and spit it back into their mouths. Oh, that's terrible. Don't repeat that. But that's basically what happens in these history classrooms. There's no wonder and there's no sort of healthy confusion. Blau talks a great deal about reading, and as he says here, reading is a process of text construction and revision, just like writing. In fact, in one, I've heard him present many, many times. And one of the things he likes to sort of almost joke about now is the fact that reading is more like writing than writing is. Reading has more revision to it than writing does, but we don't respect that. So we need to start respecting that that reading is really like writing. Blau also talks about performative literacy. Performative literacy, which he says is an enabling knowledge. He says there's a value-laden set of ideas that go along with this performative literacy. It requires an enabling knowledge, an intellectual courage, tolerance for failure, tolerance for ambiguity, paradox, and uncertainty, intellectual generosity, and fallibility. Within a lesson, where that comes from, it very simply is the types of questions that you're asking students. Are you asking them questions that they can immediately understand? Are you occasionally asking them questions, having them wait to have you enlighten them and then tell them, I have no idea what the answer is? And if that's really true, that you're asking them questions that you really don't know the answer to, then you're absolutely on the right track. So what does this mean for history? If a component of historical thinking is empathy, then make sure you represent all sides, obviously, making sense of the way participants experienced their world, even unsavory participants in unsavory worlds. That's extremely important. Am I moving this around too much? So, history, according to Bruce Lesh, history is a debate between competing interpretations of events, individuals, and ideas, based on the utilization of historical evidence. And this is from a really interesting book called Why Won't You Just Tell Us the Answer? So, history as a debate between competing interpretations of events. We say that, we believe that, but we don't practice that. So you have to put that into practice. You have to really put that into practice with your lesson planning, with your thinking about how you're going to approach your classroom. Because otherwise, your classroom becomes just one more dang thing after another. Just one long, it's something that could be taught with a timeline. So if you're going to teach with a timeline, then for heaven's sake, just buy your students all a timeline and let it go at that. You don't want to teach with a timeline. What you want to do is teach with confusion. You should be willing to put your students into a situation where they can understand why someone made even reprehensible choices. So that will allow them to grasp and evaluate competing arguments. Is this still too general? Still too general? How about fascism? Are you willing to get into fascism so much that your students can understand why someone might make the choice to become a Nazi? How about the bomb and the decision to drop the bomb? What's the thinking behind the decision that drove that decision? What are the policy choices that led to genocide of Native Americans? What's the rationale for fighting integration? So what are your choices to segregate? See, the problem here is it's very easy to understand the very top surface of Martin Luther King. I have a dream that my 4 little children will someday be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Yay, right? It's Martin Luther King. And of course, we love that speech. But there are schools that center their whole world on that speech, and they never move beyond it. And that's the end of it. The students never actually get beyond that speech alone. The teachers are too afraid to understand the other side. You see, the teachers are actually too afraid to sort of move beyond the simple little paradigm of Martin Luther King and understand who the man was. I have a dream is easy, and it gets us nowhere. It doesn't build the brain at all. It's too easy. And in fact, my students who I've had in the past who come from schools that love that speech, that make people memorize that speech, and that build their whole multicultural paradigm on that speech, they don't ever get beyond that speech or even into the speech. They don't ever read The World House by Martin Luther King. They don't ever get beyond that one dang beautiful moment where everyone was hugging and loving. But what about this? I sat on the grass and listened to the speakers, and this is someone listening to Martin Luther King, to discover we had dreamers instead of leaders leading us. Just about every one of them stood up there dreaming. Martin Luther King went on and on talking about his dream. I sat there thinking that in Canton, in Mississippi, we never had time to sleep, much less dream. Dang. Now it's kind of like, it feels like healthy sacrilege. So could you let students mull that over and think about how there's even division within civil rights? I mean, you introduce Ann Moody to them, and immediately she gets into this situation where she's a civil rights leader. She is supporting nonviolence, but then they have to make a choice. Should we have shotguns at our nonviolence house? And the answer they have is yes. You can see this little bridge from nonviolent civil rights to violent black power. She doesn't become a black power advocate, but you can see how people would stop saying freedom, freedom, freedom and start saying black power. So I think you let students mull over that and you get them into those divisions, and it's much better than just this sort of clean, happy, I have a dream speech sort of thing. One way to do that, I think, is to get students into autobiographical writing, and this will get them to write in a great number of ways. And so do autobiography. Here's one little project that I would suggest to you, and it's taken from a book by Margaret Wise Brown called The Important Book. And you can see here, here's just a brief bit about the book. So it starts by saying, the important thing about rain is that it is wet. It falls out of the sky, and it sounds like rain, and makes things shiny, and does not taste like anything, and is the color of air. But the important thing about rain is that it is wet. That's not very autobiographical, unless you're rain. But then here's what you do. You take the first line and you say, the important thing about me is that, and yes, this is in a history class. This is in a social studies class, because as you saw when we visited a class, Noemi's class in Porterville, she spends those first couple weeks getting to know students. She spends that time building that groundwork so that she knows them, they know her, and this is exactly the type of writing that you should have them do to start that process. So the first line is, the important thing about me is, and then students would finish that statement. Then you give them this fabulous handout that says, with enough motivation, I just might this, or I'm good at that. One personal goal is this, or describe a special talent. So this is for the middle, and they would choose a couple of these sort of brainstorm ideas, put it in the middle. So they start with, the important thing about me is this business in the middle, and then they end with the same line. So the last line says the same thing. But the important thing about me is, repeats that same line, or repeats that first line. Get them into autobiographical writing. Once they see that they have a part in your classroom, they'll see that you actually like them. And that's pretty important. That's really pretty important. I think it was Father, what's his name, the guy from Homeboy Industries, Tattoos on the Heart, that guy. But he says in teaching inner city kids especially, it's especially important that you know their names before they know your name. It doesn't really matter if they know your name so much, but you should definitely know their names. It's crucial that you know them, that they know that you love them. You don't have to give them hugs and say you love them, but you should love them. So in addition, and this goes along with the autobiographical writing, play with poetry. Play with poetry and history. Show them whatever historical poems. You can find modern poems that are fabulous, and this is one that's fabulously difficult. So this is our fourth principle of literacy strategy that should work its way into your history classroom. So play with poetry. Here's a poem that is about colonization, and it's about colonization in Africa, I think. It's incredibly difficult. I've read this poem about 20 times, and I have no idea what it says. I mean, honestly, I don't even know what it says, let alone what it means. So it's by Walker Gibson. It's called Billiards. Late of the jungle, wild and dim, sliced from the elephant's ivory limb, painted, polished, hear these spheres, rehearse their civilized careers. You could read The White Man's Bird and couple it with this, and then talk Scramble for Africa. Whatever you want to do, just play with poetry. You could even take out some Billy Collins and give them this fabulous poem called An Introduction to Poetry. Students are scared of poetry many times, and rightly so. Poetry is scary. But this is an excellent poem because it's about the interpretation of poetry and how, so I like to replace the word poem with the word history, because you could say the same thing about the interpretation of history and how bad it is sometimes by us and by students. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide. So you could do the same thing with history. I asked them to take a history and hold it up to the light with a color like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. So I say drop a mouse into a history and watch him probe his way out. Or walk inside the history's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem. That's why he's a poet laureate. I want them to water ski across the surface of the poem, or water ski across the purpose of history, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the history to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find what it really means. That's in terms of history. That's exactly that sums up a lot, and so we don't want to be beating history with a rope or with a hose. Let's see. So we're going to do one more, and then we'll take a brief break. Well, actually, we'll move on to the second video because I'm worried about uploading it. So this next literacy strategy is also practical. It's not theoretical, and it is from an English teacher that I met at Script, South Coast Writing Project. Her name is Laura Powell. I'll give her sufficient credit here, and it's called multi-genre writing. And we've done this a little bit when we were talking about was it Ruth Snyder, I think. So we did this when we were talking about Ruth Snyder and that fabulous case from the 1920s. It has an application all over history. You could do this with any history. What it gets students to do then is to write with different genres. So basically you start just by making a list with students, just like we did on the board together. Make a list of genres together as a class. The first answer when you say make a list of genres will be, what's a genre? So you can explain it to them if you want. You don't have to. But once you start to look at these genres, you start to say journal entry, personal letter, greeting card, schedule, list of things to do, an inner monologue, classified or personal ad, poetry, song, short story, adventure, magazine story. It becomes overwhelming the number of genres that you can get into. Ghost story, birth certificate, website, receipt, all sorts of genres. You can use modern ones also. Then once you have that list of genres, you develop a theme, and that's probably based on what you're covering in class at the time. And you could do this individually or as a class. So your theme might just be the Great Depression. Let's say you're studying the Great Depression. And then after that, each student would then choose 5 genres and produce work in each of the areas. So if they pick a wedding invitation, then they might have a Depression-era wedding invitation. That could be fabulous. If they pick a myth or a tall tale, they could take some theme from the Depression and turn it into a myth. They could take some theme from the Depression and turn it into a ghost story or whatever they want. So having them write in multi-genres is extremely important. In fact, it has theoretical implications, and I'm sure you've thought about this already, but it's Mikhail Bakhtin who says that any utterance then forms its own genre in a sense. So as he says, any utterance of live speech, a live utterance, is inherently responsive. Any understanding is imbued with response and necessarily elicits it in one form or another. The listener becomes the speaker. So you can read this on your own, but these genres are fabulous moments for rethinking what's going on in your history classrooms, and you can have them working with different genres all throughout the year. You could compile that into a fabulous little portfolio, and boom, you've got something great to. You could even make it into a book of genre writing throughout the year, and have your students use that. So before we get on to number 6, we will I will take a short break. This is the end of video number 1, and away we go.